It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon, until my son walked in with an envelope that changed everything. He smiled, said it was good news, and handed me a check for $15,000. I thought it was a gift, a small token of care. Then he said he'd sold my house, the same house his father and I built, for $1.2 million. My name, my memories, my home, gone. Just like that. But what he didn't know was that I still had one thing left, proof, and that proof would destroy his lie. Well, I'm glad you're here. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe, tell me where you're watching from, and drop a heart if you believe no one should ever sell their parents' home behind their back. That afternoon, sunlight came through the window just like any other day. My teacup was still warm, the news humming softly in the background, when my son arrived at my door. He was smiling. Not the kind of smile a son gives his mother, but the kind people wear when they think they've done something clever. He sat down across from me, placed a thin white envelope on the table, and said, "Good news, Mum." I opened it slowly. Inside was a check for $15,000. No note, no explanation, just that piece of paper with my name on it. Before I could even ask, he said proudly that he'd sold the house, my house, for $1.2 million. He said it like a businessman, not a son. I stared at him, the words not fully reaching my mind. My fingers trembled, not from anger, but from disbelief. I asked him, very quietly, what he meant. He smiled again, told me I didn't have to worry anymore, that he'd taken care of everything. Taken care of everything. That's what he said. But what he had really done was take away everything. He looked at me as if I should be grateful, as if that check was some kind of gift. $15,000 for the house his father and I built, the one we saved every coin for, brick by brick, year after year. The one that still smelled faintly of old pine floors and lemon polish. The one that had held his first steps, his laughter, and our struggles. All that reduced to one check and one sentence. I folded the paper back into the envelope and slid it across the table. He didn't even notice the way my hands shook. He started talking about investments, about how it was the smart move, how he was using the money to pay off debts and expand his business. He said it was for the family, for our future. But I already knew it wasn't about family. It was about greed. The quiet kind that grows slowly, dressed in logic and numbers. He told me I could stay with him and his wife for a few weeks, as if I were some unwanted guest who needed managing. I nodded, pretending to agree. I wanted him to think I accepted it. I wanted him to believe he'd fooled me. But deep inside, I knew something he didn't. That smile of his wouldn't last long. When he left, I sat there for a long time, the silence heavier than it had ever been. The envelope lay on the table between us like a gravestone. I picked it up, held it against my chest, and thought of my late husband. He would have been furious, not because of the money, but because of the betrayal. We had raised a son who once promised to protect me. Now he had stolen the very thing that kept me safe. I walked through the rooms that night, touching the furniture, the curtains, the photographs on the wall. Every corner of that house had a memory. My husband reading in his chair, my son running down the hall with a school bag too big for his shoulders, me cooking dinner on nights when we had almost nothing left. I thought about how many times I'd told my son this house was his home too. Now I understood. To him, home was just another asset to sell. I didn't cry. Not that night. I sat at the kitchen table until the moonlight reached the floor. The check was still there. $15,000. The price of betrayal. I realized then that I hadn't just lost a house. I had lost a son. But what he didn't know was that I still had my name. And my name was still on the original papers. The same papers that could tear his little game apart. He had sold my home without my permission, but he had no idea what the law still owed me. That night, I made a promise. Not out of revenge, but out of respect for everything my husband and I had built. I wasn't going to let my son's greed bury our years of sacrifice. If he wanted to play with numbers, I would show him what those numbers really meant. He thought he had won. He thought I was too old, too quiet, too tired to fight. But he forgot one thing. I'd spent my entire life surviving worse than this, and by the time he realized what I was capable of, it would be far too late. That house wasn't just a building. It was a lifetime stitched into wood, walls, and weather. My husband and I built it together when we were still young enough to dream, but old enough to know the cost of every brick. It wasn't much at first. 2 rooms, a leaking roof, and a small patch of garden that grew wild every spring. But it was ours. Every corner carried our sweat. Every tile was bought after some other sacrifice. We skipped holidays, sold the old car, and saved every penny until it finally became a home worth protecting. When my husband passed, I thought the hardest part of life was behind me. I had lost him, yes, but I still had the house. The place where his laughter lived, where his tools still sat in the shed, and where I could still feel his presence in every creak of the floorboards. The thought of leaving it never crossed my mind. It was more than land. It was memory. My son grew up inside those same walls. He had his first birthday there, his first broken toy, his first scraped knee. That house saw him become everything he is, and everything he's not. After his father died, I gave him the master bedroom. I wanted him to feel safe, wanted him to know he was still home. When he lost his first job, it was me who covered his rent. When he said he wanted to start a business, it was me who signed the papers. And when he promised he'd take care of the house for me, I believed him. I added his name to the title years later. It was my mistake, the kind that only love can make. I thought it would protect him, that it would make things easier if something ever happened to me. I didn't think of lawyers, loopholes, or greed. I thought of family. I thought of trust. He used to say the house was his favorite place in the world. He'd talk about hosting family dinners, raising his own children there, carrying on what his father built. I remember smiling whenever he said that. I thought he meant it. I thought he saw what that home truly meant. Not money, not property, but legacy. But over time, the warmth changed. He started treating it like an asset, not an inheritance. He spoke about it in numbers, not memories. "It's worth a lot now," he said once, looking at the garden as if he could already see dollar signs hanging from the apple tree. I laughed it off then. I told myself it was harmless. But looking back, I realized that's when he stopped calling it home. That's when he started calling it the house. That change in language should have warned me. People show their hearts in how they name things. For me, it was always our home. For him, it became the property. And the day he sold it, that difference finally took shape in the worst way. That house held everything good in my life. The laughter of my husband echoing through the hall when he came home tired from work. The smell of his pipe smoke blending with the scent of roast on Sundays. The nights when the lights flickered, and we'd sit by candlelight, making jokes about the haunted wiring. Even the silence had its own rhythm there. It was the kind of silence that made you feel safe, not alone. So when my son sold it, it wasn't just about losing walls or a roof. It was about losing the last piece of my life that still felt whole. He didn't just sell a building, he sold the history of our family. He turned every sacrifice we made into profit, and every memory into currency. When I looked at that check, that miserable, insulting check, all I could see was how little he thought I was worth. $15,000. That was the price he put on his mother's love, his father's sweat, our family's story. I realized then that the house was gone, but something else was still standing. Me. I had spent decades being strong for everyone else. Now it was time to be strong for myself. I wasn't going to let my husband's memory end in a bank statement. That house mattered because it held proof that love built something real in this world. And if he thought he could erase that with one transaction, he was about to learn that some things can't be sold. Not love, not loyalty, and definitely not justice. The next morning, I decided to see the truth with my own eyes. I took the check, folded it into my handbag, and went to the land registry office. My heart pounded the entire bus ride there. Part of me still wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding, that maybe he hadn't meant to sell it, that maybe I'd misheard. But deep down, I already knew. Mothers always do. When I reached the counter, I handed the clerk my house address and asked for the recent ownership record. She pulled up the file, scanned the screen, and hesitated. That pause told me more than any words could. Then she looked up, pity in her eyes, and said, "Ma'am, the property was sold 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks. While I was sitting in that same living room, knitting near the window, believing everything was fine, my son had already erased me from the records. I asked for a copy of the sale deed. When she printed it, I stared at the signature line. My name was there, but it wasn't mine. The writing was slanted, shaky, wrong. A forgery, clear as daylight. He hadn't even tried to make it convincing. He had simply signed my name and walked away with the life I built. The buyer's name was someone I didn't recognize, but the agent's address was familiar. It was connected to my son's business partner, the same one who once came to dinner bragging about smart investments. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just a sale. It was a transaction built on betrayal. I asked the clerk where the funds had been transferred. She couldn't tell me much, only that the payment went into an account under my son's company. Not ours, his. That $1.2 million never even touched my name. He had used the power of co-ownership to claim full authority. For a moment, the room spun. My legs felt heavy, my throat dry. I remembered the day I added him to that title, standing in the solicitor's office, smiling proudly, saying, "This way, you'll always have security." I never realized I was handing him the knife he'd used to cut me out of my own home. When I stepped outside, the air felt strange. Sharp, cold, unwelcoming. I took the bus back, but when it passed by my street, I couldn't get off. I looked out the window and saw strangers walking through my front gate. Painters. Movers. Someone's new car parked in my old driveway. My curtains gone, my garden trampled, my home gone. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. I just sat there on the bus until it reached the end of the route. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my friend's spare room, the check still folded in my hand, the ink starting to blur from the sweat of my palms. I thought about how easy it had been for him. A few papers, a few lies, and everything his father and I built was gone. But beneath the heartbreak, something else began to grow. Clarity. I started to see it, not as the end of something, but the beginning of something else. My husband had always said, if someone cheats you, don't shout, prove. And I intended to prove. The next morning, I called my husband's old solicitor, the one who'd handled all our property records. I told him what happened, every word, every number, every signature. He asked me to meet him in person. When I arrived, I handed him the documents. He examined them carefully, tracing each signature with a slow finger. Then he looked up and said, "Mrs. Harris, this is fraud. Clear, deliberate fraud." That's when I felt the first flicker of power return to my chest. For the first time in days, I wasn't just a mother betrayed. I was a woman preparing for justice. He told me that since my husband's will had never been legally revoked, there might still be a way to reclaim everything. There were papers that could override the false sale, bank trails that could expose where the money went. He said, "You won't need to confront him. The law will." I left that office feeling lighter than I had in weeks. My son thought he had ended my story, but he had only written the first chapter of his own downfall. That night felt longer than any in my life. The silence in the room didn't comfort me. It pressed against my chest, heavy and cold. I sat by the small window of my friend's spare room, watching the streetlights flicker. The check still sat on the table beside me, that same white envelope now creased and dirty from being opened too many times. Every time I looked at it, I felt a wave of shame, anger, and disbelief wash over me all at once. I thought of my husband. If he were still alive, none of this would have happened. He trusted our son the way only a father could. He used to say, "He's got your heart and my head." But that night, I realized our boy had neither. He had taken everything that symbolized us, our work, our hope, our future, and turned it into something ugly. He had turned love into currency. I couldn't sleep, so I wandered through my thoughts like an old house I didn't recognize anymore. Every memory of him, his first day of school, his wedding, his late-night calls asking for help, played like a film I wished I could turn off. I remembered the way he'd once hugged me and said, "Mom, you'll never have to worry." Now those words mocked me. The betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about being made small by the one person I thought would protect me. I had stood beside my husband through every hardship, loss, sickness, debt, and now, after everything, I was being cast aside like a stranger. That kind of hurt doesn't fade. It settles. I cried quietly that night, not out of weakness, but because I knew something had to die inside me before I could move forward. The part that still believed my son was the same boy I raised. When I finally stopped crying, I felt something change. The grief didn't leave. It hardened. It became focus. I took the check and placed it under the small desk lamp. The light made the numbers glow. $15,000. Such a small figure, yet it represented the price of my dignity. I tore it in half, then again and again, until the pieces were nothing but dust between my fingers. I wasn't going to cash betrayal. That night, I made a silent promise. To myself, to my husband, to the woman I used to be. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to beg. And I wasn't going to let my son believe he could get away with this. When the first light of morning touched the curtains, I already knew what to do. I didn't need revenge. I needed clarity. And clarity meant paperwork. I took out an old folder that I had kept for decades, yellowed, fragile, filled with every document that had ever meant something: marriage certificate, insurance forms, property deeds, my husband's will. I laid them all out on the bed one by one. I noticed something I had forgotten: an old handwritten clause in my husband's will that transferred ownership to me indefinitely, with a witness signature still intact. That meant the house had never legally passed to my son. It felt like my husband was still protecting me, even from the grave. The sun rose, and I stood up. I was tired, but my fear was gone. My heart still ached, but it no longer trembled. The woman who had walked into that room feeling broken wasn't the same one who would walk out. My son thought he had ended everything, but all he had done was wake something inside me that had been quiet for too long. The next step was simple. Not emotional, not dramatic, just necessary. I would build my case. Slowly, silently, legally. I looked at the torn pieces of the check on the table and smiled faintly. That paper had meant to buy my silence. Instead, it had bought me clarity. By the time the clock struck 7, I was dressed, my handbag packed with every file I needed. The world outside didn't know it yet, but the woman they thought was helpless was about to become their biggest problem. The next morning, I made the call that changed everything. I dialed the number of Mr. Reeves, the same solicitor who had handled my husband's affairs years ago. His voice was older now, slower, but still steady, still calm. When I told him who I was, he remembered immediately. I didn't waste time explaining emotions. I explained facts. My son had sold my house for $1.2 million. My name was forged, and all I had left in my hand was a check worth $15,000. He went silent for a few seconds. Then he said, "Bring me everything, every paper, every letter, every detail." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. By noon, I was sitting in his small oak-paneled office. I placed the envelope on his desk, then unfolded the torn check, the photocopy of the sale deed, and the will I had rediscovered the night before. He examined each one carefully. Every so often, he would hum under his breath, a habit he'd had since the day my husband first hired him. Then he looked up at me and said, "Mrs. Harris, you're in a strong position. What your son did is not only immoral, it's criminal." He explained everything with precision. The forged signature alone was enough to nullify the sale. The false declaration on the property transfer could be prosecuted as fraud. And because my husband's will was still legally active, the sale itself was void. All we needed was proof. Paper proof. And that was exactly what I had. We began building the file piece by piece. Bank statements, property registration dates, communication records between my son and the estate agent, every document that could expose his deception. Mr. Reeves's assistant made copies while I sat quietly in the corner, my mind somewhere between heartbreak and relief. For years, I had trusted words. Now I was learning that ink carried more power than promises. By late afternoon, Mr. Reeves had already drafted the first set of legal notices. One was addressed to the land registry to freeze the transfer process, pending investigation. Another was for the bank, requesting verification of the funds and confirmation of the receiving account. And the third, the one that mattered most, was a formal demand to my son, giving him 48 hours to provide an explanation before the matter went to court. I remember looking at the stack of papers on the desk. Each sheet felt heavier than the last, not just because of what they meant legally, but because of what they meant personally. They were the physical proof of betrayal. But they were also proof that I still had control. When I signed the legal authorization, Mr. Reeves smiled faintly and said something I'll never forget. "We don't shout for justice, Mrs. Harris. We file for it." Those words settled in my mind like armor. I had spent days feeling powerless, but now, with every document we stamped and every form we sealed, I began to feel strength returning to me. After I left his office, I walked through the city streets slowly. Everything looked different. The buildings, the people, even the air. I had walked into that office as a mother in pain. I walked out as a woman with purpose. That night, I didn't cry. I cooked myself a small meal, sat by the window, and wrote a list in my notebook. Every step we'd take, every person who needed to be informed, every record to collect. I would follow it like a map. Somewhere deep down, I realized that my husband would have been proud. He always said that strength didn't need to be loud, it just needed to be steady. And that's what I was now. Steady. The next few days were quiet, but I could feel movement behind the silence. Mr. Reeves called with updates. The registry had acknowledged the freeze request, and the buyer's funds had been temporarily held. The investigation had officially begun. My son didn't know it yet, but the ground under his feet was already shifting. He thought he had won when he sold that house, but all he'd really done was sign his own downfall, with my forged name as the witness. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, calls, and quiet determination. I wasn't rushing. I was waiting, watching, letting the evidence speak louder than emotion ever could. Mr. Reeves handled most of it, but he made sure I saw every step, every document, every detail. He said, "Truth works best when the person wronged understands how it's built." And I understood perfectly. The investigation began with the banks. Mr. Reeves had requested all transaction records tied to my son's company account. When they arrived, the statements told a story that no mother ever wants to read. The $1.2 million from the sale had been split into 3 accounts, one under his business, one under his wife's name, and another registered to a shell company I'd never heard of. The transfers were quick, deliberate, and timed within hours of the sale being completed. Then came the gambling transactions. Dozens of payments to online casinos and credit repayment services. Some of the charges went back months, maybe even years. It was clear he hadn't sold the house for a good business move or a better future. He'd sold it to cover his own debt and greed. I sat across from Mr. Reeves as he explained it all. His voice was calm, measured. Mine was silent. It's strange how the human heart reacts to truth. It doesn't always break. Sometimes it just stops for a while. The forgery expert's report arrived next. It was official confirmation that the signature on the sale deed wasn't mine. The strokes were inconsistent, the ink pattern mismatched, the pressure on the paper off by several grams. It was no longer a suspicion. It was proof, the kind that held up in court. We sent a copy of the report to the Fraud Investigation Office. They didn't take long to respond. Within a week, I received notice that my case had been classified under property fraud and coercion, a serious offense with heavy penalties. I wasn't after punishment, I was after acknowledgement, but I knew one would lead to the other. Meanwhile, my son must have started realizing something was wrong. He called a few times. I didn't answer. Then he texted, asking if I'd cash the check. That made me smile for the first time in days. He thought I was still holding that useless piece of paper. He had no idea it was already ashes in my bin. The local paper even carried a small notice about a domestic property dispute under legal review. I didn't share it or speak about it, but people noticed. Neighbors stopped me at the shop, whispering that they'd heard rumors. I didn't confirm or deny anything. I simply said, "The law is handling it." And it was. Every night, I went through the copies of documents I kept neatly stacked in a folder. The will, the fake deed, the bank statements. I was building my own understanding of justice. My husband's handwriting on the will always caught my eye. That signature reminded me why I was fighting. He had trusted that this home would protect me long after he was gone. It was my duty to make sure it did. The final piece of the puzzle came when Mr. Reeves obtained communication logs between my son and the estate agent. The emails were revealing. Clear instructions from my son about how to process the sale quickly and avoid unnecessary delays with the elderly co-owner. Those words, elderly co-owner, burned into me. That's how he saw me. Not as his mother, not as his guardian, not even as a person. Just an obstacle. But now, he was the one facing obstacles. The investigation had frozen his company's accounts, restricted property transfers, and opened a review of his tax records. Everything he thought was hidden was now crawling into the light. I didn't take pleasure in it. I didn't want to. But I felt something stronger than satisfaction. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing the truth has started walking, even if slowly. Late one evening, I received a call from Mr. Reeves. His voice was firm, almost satisfied. He said, "Mrs. Harris, we've got him exactly where we need him. His actions are traceable, every dollar, every forgery, every lie." I thanked him and hung up. Then I looked out the window, where the streetlights flickered softly. For the first time in months, I felt I could breathe again. The world hadn't turned cruel. People had. But justice, quiet and patient, still existed for those who dared to look for it. My son thought I was weak because I stayed silent. What he never understood was that silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes, it's just the sound of something powerful being prepared. The day the past fought back began like any other. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping weak tea, when Mr. Reeves called with a quiet urgency in his voice. He said he had found something that would change everything. My late husband's original will, the one written before his illness, had resurfaced in the firm's archives. It wasn't a copy. It was the original document, complete with signatures and witnesses. And buried within it was a clause that my son never knew existed, one that ensured I remained the sole owner of the property until my death, with any sale requiring my written approval. That single clause made every action my son had taken completely invalid. It was as if the law itself had reached through time and placed a shield around me. The sale could be reversed, the money could be frozen, and the house, the home that held my entire life, was still mine. Mr. Reeves moved fast. He filed an emergency injunction to halt any further development on the property. Within 48 hours, the renovation crews were ordered to stop work, and the buyer was informed that the title transfer was under legal dispute. The $1.2 million payment was flagged, and the remaining funds in my son's accounts were placed under temporary hold pending investigation. The news spread quietly but quickly. Neighbors noticed when the trucks stopped showing up. My son must have realized something was wrong when his business card was declined at a hotel. For the first time, I was the one with the power of silence, the kind that unsettles people who rely on control. That evening, I sat by the window with my old photo album. My husband's face smiled back at me from the faded pictures, Birthdays, Christmas mornings, long walks near the coast. He had built our life with such care, always making sure there was protection for the future. He must have known that one day, someone might try to take what was ours. And even in death, he had made sure that wouldn't happen. I could almost hear his voice in my head, calm and certain, saying, "You don't fight by shouting. You fight by standing tall." When I looked at the documents again, I noticed something else. My son's arrogance had left traces everywhere. His lawyer had failed to cross-check the original ownership deed. The estate agent had ignored missing authorizations. Even the notary had stamped the document without a valid witness. Every part of the transaction was built on carelessness and greed. That's why I didn't need revenge. The truth was already punishing him in ways I never could. By the end of the week, the injunction had been approved. My name was reinstated as the rightful owner of the property, and my son received formal notice of the lawsuit. I didn't gloat, but I did allow myself one deep breath of relief. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. The following morning, a letter arrived at my door. It was from the bank, confirming that the funds from the house sale were now held in a secure legal account pending final judgment. The letter also included a single sentence that made me smile. Any fraudulent withdrawal attempts will result in immediate prosecution. That was when I realized the past had not only fought back, it had won. In the days that followed, I didn't hear from my son. He must have been hiding behind his lawyer, trying to figure out how everything had collapsed so fast. But deep down, I knew this silence wasn't strength. It was fear. The kind of fear that comes when you realize your lies have an expiration date. As I walked through the park that evening, I thought about how everything had come full circle. Years ago, I had given him everything I owned, thinking that was what love meant. Now I had taken it all back. Not out of spite, but out of respect for myself. My husband's will, my patience, and my belief in quiet strength had brought me here. The past hadn't just fought back. It had reminded me who I was before I was a mother, before I was betrayed. I wasn't a victim. I was a survivor who had finally learned that some battles don't need shouting. They just need the right papers signed at the right time. The day of the court hearing was quiet, but inside me, everything felt loud. My heart wasn't racing from fear. It was steady from certainty. I had spent weeks gathering documents, preparing statements, and watching the truth unfold piece by piece. Now, all that was left was to sit, listen, and let the law finish what I had started. When I walked into the courtroom, the first person I saw was my son. He looked smaller somehow, not because of age or illness, but because guilt shrinks a person faster than time ever could. He avoided my eyes. His lawyer stood beside him, whispering something quickly, like a man trying to save a sinking ship. Across the aisle, Mr. Reeves sat poised, papers in hand, calm as ever. He gave me a small nod, reassurance that I didn't need to speak. The evidence would do the talking for both of us. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The case began with the registrar confirming the documents. The forged signature, the transfer papers, the financial trail of the $1.2 million, and the original will that invalidated everything my son had done. The buyer was represented too, visibly angry that his purchase had turned into a fraud case. But even he knew he'd been caught in someone else's deceit. Then came the statements. Mr. Reeves presented everything in order: the forensic analysis, the financial audit, and the witness testimony from the land office clerk who had flagged the inconsistencies. The timeline was flawless. My son's lawyer tried to argue it was a misunderstanding, a family dispute exaggerated by miscommunication. But each time he tried, another document was placed on the table, another nail in the coffin of that excuse. When it was time for my son to speak, his voice cracked. He talked about stress, about his struggling business, about desperation. He said he didn't mean to hurt anyone, that he thought he could fix it later. But forgery doesn't come from confusion. It comes from calculation. I didn't interrupt. I didn't even move. I simply looked at him. Not with anger, but with a kind of quiet pity I didn't know I still had. The judge listened carefully. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm but firm. He said the evidence left no doubt. The sale was illegal. The property was to be returned to me immediately, the full sale amount seized and placed into court custody, and restitution ordered for damages. He also ruled that the matter would be referred for criminal investigation into document fraud and coercion. There was a pause, a long, heavy silence. My son's shoulders slumped. His lawyer leaned close, whispering again, but this time there was no saving him. I looked down at my hands resting on the wooden bench. They were old hands, veined and fragile, but they were still strong enough to sign the truth that saved me. When the judge struck the gavel, the sound echoed like a final word in a story that had gone on too long. Justice had been served, not with shouting or vengeance, but with paperwork, patience, and time. As people began to leave, Mr. Reeves gathered the documents, stacked them neatly, and handed me a folder. "It's done," he said. I thanked him, but I didn't smile. Not yet. Not in that room. There was nothing to celebrate in seeing your own child defeated, only relief that what was right had survived what was wrong. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter, cleaner. I stood for a moment under the gray sky, thinking about my husband. He would have been proud, not because I won, but because I didn't lose myself while fighting. My son walked past me quietly, head lowered, eyes red. For a second, I thought he might say something, but he didn't. Maybe there were no words left that could fill the space he had created between us, and I didn't need to hear them. Some apologies belong to time, not people. That evening, I placed the folder on my kitchen table, next to the old photo of my husband. The house wasn't mine because of law. It was mine because I had protected it when love had failed. Justice, I realized, doesn't roar. It doesn't rage. It simply arrives, calm and undeniable, when you've done everything quietly right. After the court's final decision, I didn't rush to celebrate. There was no champagne, no victory speech, no raised glass. I simply went home, sat on the same kitchen chair I'd always sat on, and exhaled. The air felt different, clean, lighter, almost new. The walls, once heavy with grief, seemed to breathe again. Justice had settled quietly inside my home, not like thunder, but like sunlight after a storm. Within weeks, I finalized the legal paperwork. The house was restored in my name, all accounts in my control again. Mr. Reeves insisted on adding an extra layer of security to every document. New passwords, digital copies, witnesses on every signature. I agreed. I had learned the hard way that love without boundaries invites betrayal. Then came the unexpected part. What to do next? I could have stayed in that house, the same walls that had heard laughter, shouting, betrayal, and then justice. But every time I walked past the living room, I could still see him sitting there, smiling that same greedy smile the day he handed me the check. I realized peace couldn't grow where memory kept planting weeds. So, I sold the house myself. Properly, this time. No deception, no confusion, no forged paper. It wasn't revenge. It was closure. I sold it for less than the market price because I didn't want to profit from pain. I wanted release. With part of the money, I bought a small seaside cottage 2 hours away. A quiet place where mornings began with the sound of waves instead of doors slamming. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. Written in my name alone. Witnessed. Sealed. And untouchable. The rest of the money I divided carefully. A portion went into a savings fund for women over 60 who'd been victims of family fraud. I called it the Gray Shield Trust, because protection shouldn't end with age. Mr. Reeves helped me set it up, smiling as he said, "You've turned pain into something useful." That was the first time I smiled back at anyone in months. Days turned into weeks, and life began to find its rhythm again. My mornings were simple: tea, a walk along the pier, and the satisfaction of knowing that peace can exist after betrayal. Sometimes I'd see other elderly women sitting on benches, feeding pigeons, holding quiet conversations. I'd sit near them, listening. Their stories were different, but the tone was always the same: regret mixed with dignity. I knew exactly how that felt. Letters came from my son now and then, long, apologetic, filled with words like forgive, mistake, desperation. I didn't reply, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I needed silence to stay healed. Forgiveness, I realized, is not always about contact. Sometimes it's about letting the distance do the talking. There were nights when guilt still crept in, the kind that whispers, "You're a mother. You should have done more." But I silenced it with truth. I had done enough. I had raised him, fed him, educated him, trusted him. And when he betrayed that trust, I had stood up for myself. That was not cruelty. That was survival. The village locals slowly came to know my story, though I never told it directly. Some had read about the case in the paper, a quiet note about a forged sale reversed by the original owner. When they asked if that was me, I only smiled. Let them guess. Sometimes strength doesn't need to explain itself. Every evening, I'd sit on the porch, watching the sea reflect the setting sun. It reminded me that everything, no matter how deep the pain, eventually settles. Waves crash, foam fades, and the water clears. Life is much the same. I never went looking for revenge. I went looking for respect. And I found it not in my son's apology, but in my own reflection. The check he gave me for $15,000 is still with me, framed, untouched, hanging on my cottage wall. Not as a reminder of loss, but as proof that I will never again be priced so cheaply. I often sit by my cottage window now, where the ocean hums softly against the shore, and I think about how everything turned out. Life didn't end in that betrayal. It began again from it. People assume heartbreak breaks you once, but it doesn't. It breaks you in layers until you finally decide which pieces are worth putting back together. I kept only the parts of myself that remembered strength. When I think about my son, I don't feel hatred anymore. I feel distance, the kind that keeps the peace. Anger demands energy. Distance gives you rest. I realized something powerful during all of this. Family isn't defined by who shares your blood. It's defined by who protects it. And that day in court, the law protected mine better than my own child ever did. Sometimes people ask me if I regret taking him to court, if I ever lie awake wondering whether I could have forgiven instead. The answer is no. Forgiveness without accountability is permission. and I had already given him too much permission to hurt me. That house was more than bricks. It was every meal I cooked, every bill I paid, every night I worked late to keep a roof above his head. He didn't just sell property, he sold gratitude. The check he gave me still hangs on the wall, framed, untouched, right beside my husband's photograph. The two faces of my life, one that built me, one that broke me. And together, they remind me of balance. Pain and peace can live side by side. You just have to choose which one gets the louder room. Sometimes I imagine what I would say to my younger self, the woman who trusted too easily and signed her name out of love. I'd tell her, don't be ashamed of giving, but be ready to take it back when it's used against you. Because even kindness needs a backbone. Every few weeks, I still get letters from women who saw my story in the paper. Some write that their sons or daughters took their savings, their homes, their names, all in the name of love. They ask how I found the courage to fight. I tell them the truth. I didn't find courage. I found clarity. When someone shows you they can live without your respect, you must learn to live without their approval. The ocean outside my window is calm today. It's strange how something so vast can feel so familiar. I think it's because it doesn't ask for anything. It just exists, deep, strong, steady. That's what I've become. Not angry, not bitter, just certain. I've learned that revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits quietly in a courtroom, in a judge's voice, in a single signature that restores what was lost. And sometimes it whispers through the pages of a new life, a smaller home, a simpler morning, a heart that no longer waits for apologies. As I pour my tea and watch the waves, I think about that moment when my son handed me the check. He thought he was giving me closure. In truth, he gave me a beginning. Because it was in that moment when he priced my life at $15,000 that I realized I would never again let anyone else decide my worth. So now, as I speak to you, whoever's listening, remember this. One day, someone you love might treat your sacrifices like paper. Don't burn yourself proving your loyalty. Stand quietly, gather your proof, and let the truth speak for you. Because when the world thinks you've lost everything, that's when you get to show them what everything really means. If you're watching this, thank you for staying with me until the end. Tell me, if your own child tried to sell your life for a price, would you cry over the check? Or cash in your strength and start over? And if you understood what I've said tonight, drop a heart. Not for my pain, but for your courage to never let anyone decide your worth again.